Hello, everybody. So, firstly, we need to do a sound check. Can everybody hear me okay? Can everybody hear me okay? Yes, good. I'm so glad that people can hear me. Oh, that's a relief. So, how are we all doing? Are we having a good evening? So, um, this is hopefully going to be the first of what will turn out to be a long series of things that I will do, which are talks about subjects in the domain of railway and transport history and mobility history. And we'll have people come on and speak. We'll have people come in and do a Q&A. This is a sort of Q&A, a sort of chat event. So if you've got any slide questions, I've got some slides. We can talk about things. Please feel free to ask them. I'll try and ask them. I'll try and do my best. And hopefully you'll enjoy it. So, firstly, the first thing I'm going to do at the start of each one is tell you what I'm drinking, because this is a tavern. It is a place for relaxation. And so, what I'm drinking today, and because I love this brewery and I'm a big fan, I'm a big supporter of these guys, I know them, Anspach and Hobday in London, and they do everything. So, I'm drinking the Ordinary Bitter, which is an exemplar of the style, and they do everything from that to pale ales, and hopefully, they do wonderful other sort of interesting things, IPAs, and really do some experimental stuff. But hopefully, might be tea sometimes, but that's what I'm drinking today. So on with the show. So I think what I'm going to sort of talk about is the development of railway marketing, sort of from 1900. But I think I want to talk about the backstory. And as I say, this is a Q&A. So if you've got any questions that come in, if you've got any sort of ideas or thoughts, and hopefully I can help you guide you through some of those subjects. But what we got on the screen there is a excursion notice from 1858. And I think one of the things, if we are talking about railway marketing in the 19th century, particularly, is that it very much tells you what exactly is going on. You know, it tells you what what the sort of services are available, but it doesn't really. It's not really inspiring. I like this one because it's got a train at the top. It's got, it's got a nice. It's a nice design, and a lot of early adverts had that sort of outline, but it doesn't really tell you much. And a similar thing is the case with other forms of advertising. So if I go to the next slide, hopefully it'll work. So these are a couple of handbills, and I think there are, a number of different forms of advertising in this period. There are the handbills, there are the adverts that we've just seen in newspapers, and there are also bills that were pasted up at stations. And as I say, they just tell you what's going on. They don't really give you much. And the railways in this period very much conceptualize the market as you just tell people, and they'll either turn up or they won't. And if we're talking about holidays and long distance things, it was sort of a zero sum game that people would just they would, if you took one company took the business off another, uh, there was a sort of finite amount of business, and if one company took it off another, there would be less for overall, And this wasn't really, it wasn't a really sort of, by modern standards, by any means, a sort of complex understanding of the consumer base. And I think one of the things they kind of did sort of understand was, well, real incomes are rising in the late 19th century. Um, real incomes, and so there's more people being able to afford discretionary travel, but that's the only sort of marker. And of course, people in the late 19th century are sort of extending into many different domains. That they're exploring leisure for the first time. The railways start market segmenting. So what we mean by that is they start breaking down the market into discrete groups to target appeals to them. For instance, cyclists have special services and tickets put on, or walkers into the countryside. And this is, should we say, a lot of the sort of middle class, and it's a sort of limited amount of people. So the middle class is growing, and especially in and around London, which London became the clerical hub of Britain, the number of people um, grew who were affording these things, and I think that's going to be key when we get to the 1900s. And so Gareth loves the Wild West style branding in action. Yeah, I love the amount of fontage that is on display. It's just quite astounding. So we've got a couple of examples, and the bills at stations actually didn't really change until the 1950s. They didn't get eliminated in the way we understand it until the 1950s. We can argue about why that happened, and that's perhaps for a different time. But institutional lag, and they were effective to get a notice out to millions of people, or hundreds, millions in the case of the big four, but hundreds and thousands in the case of the smaller regional railway companies. Actually, sending out a notice in a newspaper was probably most effective if you're going to sell a short excursion away to a town or a football match. You don't need grand, conceptually deep advertising. So, it works for them. But I think one of the things that happens in the late 19th century is that railways appreciate that competition is growing. And I'm going to foreground here the work of academic from York. He's moved on now, but Hiroki Shin. And I should say, I researched this subject. I researched these things, and I've done research on the Edwardian period and the Interwar period with regards to marketing. But actually, I'm going to draw on the work of colleagues, and I'll flag that to you when that happens. But what the thing that's interesting about these two adverts is that they're actually the same. One is from the Great Western Railway, one is from the Midland Railway. In the 1860s and thereon, railway companies were appreciating that if they spent hundreds and thousands of pounds on advertising, competitive advertising, they would be out of pocket. It would cost them a lot of money. So they start developing these coordinated approaches through the railway clearinghouse, especially certain arrangements at certain times. So it's an appreciation of, while other sectors of the economy are actually starting to develop things like branding at this time, the railways actually restrict because of their competitive environment. And this is Shin's argument. They restrict because of their competitive environment the nature of their advertising. And actually, while I mention it, I do want to sort of clarify what we're talking about here today. We're not just talking about advertising. Marketing is distinct from advertising. Advertising is a part of marketing. Of course, advertising is everything from what do you know, trying to learn about your customers, developing products, selling the products, and then taking that information of how well they're sold and feeding it back into the process. Idealistic. That happens in this period. It doesn't really happen in this. We'll get to it. We'll unpack it. We'll talk about it because it changes. But that's what we mean by marketing. We're looking at the whole process. And so there is this agreement through the railway clearinghouse between the different railway companies. So there's that. So let's see what else we've got. So something starts happening. I'm gonna confess a slight not love. Love's not the right word, but I think an interest in the man whose name is on the bottom of the one on the left, Sam Fay. Actually, he's on the bottom of the right one as well. He was he was a sort of figurehead in my PhD thesis on the London South Western Railway. But what happens in the Edwardian period is things start changing. Railway profitability tends to decline from the 1890s. There's massive spike in coal prices, and this affects all parts of the economy. The railways are faced with declining profits, and they're also coming under pressure from tramways on sort of domestic suburban routes, and even motor cars, especially for some of the elite who can afford them at this time, which are a very small number, but they start coming under pressure. So what we get from the Edwardian period on the context of a development of advertising is a change to the approach. So various things start happening. As I say, if anybody's got any questions as we go, please just ask. I've got it up there so I can answer things. I'm happy to do so. I'm just going to talk, and if you've got any questions. But what they start doing is they start thinking a bit more closely about, rather than just thinking that there's a sort of finite number of passengers, they start thinking about shaping demand and developing demand and understanding more about their customers in by modern standards, an exceedingly rudimentary way. The London North Western Railway encouraged their frontline staff, for example, to start feeding back information about, well, where are our trains uncompetitive against other companies, and other companies do similar. And they start developing a sort of more, or trying to develop a more nuanced approach about trying to, well, if you weren't going to travel, how are we going to try and make you travel? How are we going to try and develop that idea? And the other thing that changes is that the competition changes, the nature of competition. So, of course, everybody knows in the 1880s, 1890s, we get the race to the north. It's very much point-to-point competition. We are going to try and win your traffic by getting you to X place quicker. Race to the north arguably is a publicity stunt, but it really is an emblematic of this speed wars. That's not really a phrase, but the speed, the race is to different places. But what happens is in the Edwardian period is we get a development of interregional competition. So North Wales is fighting against Cornwall, and Cornish Riviera emerges at this time, and it's fascinating actually. If you type in on the old newspapers a Cornish Riviera Express, the spike goes upwards. The spike goes upwards in like 1908 or 1907. So we got a question from so this is actually a great question from Gareth. Thank you, Gareth. The GCR came along into London at least as a relatively new player. Did this manifest in a more effective approach compared with the likes to GNR and LNWR? And this is actually a great question because that's what I was going to go on to. So you get the emergence of advertising departments in the Great Western Railway. I think it starts there in the 1870s, and the Midlands starts a similar thing a bit later. But they're sort of subject to the superintendent of the lines office. They're very much attached to the operational departments. But actually, what happens in 1902 is, well, the Great Central Main Line opens in 1899, of course, and this man, Sam Fay, he decides to create a publicity department. Its first dedicated publicity department under the general manager. It's given a higher status within the organization, and it revolutionizes the approach. It's very much forward thinking. It tries to better manipulate consumer desire, and other departments follow suit. Companies follow suit. So a bit slower. So some of the older ones, the London North Western Railway has a very confused relationship with its advertising. Its advertising department's all over the place. It's well, one bit. It's in fact the most advanced part of the LNWR's advertising department, and really do not ask me why. I've never found this out. Was in the goods department, and it decided to merge different units in 1909 with Frank Ree comes in as general manager, and it goes forward. The London South Western Railway had 3 districts, and each of them, up until 1912, had an advertising section, and then they're merged in 1912 when Herbert Walker. You can probably see a pattern here. A new general manager comes in, boom, advertising department dedicated to trying to gain traffic. And there is a very much a sort of shift towards these departments that have an important status. I wouldn't say they're as high as they were in the interwar years, but they're important. And so Barry was saying, well, Barry's asked, what were the target audiences for these posters? Is it the London or Northwest? Well, I think one of the things that happens is that you do get a lot of London-centric advertising, and I think the regional aspect of advertising in the railways is something that we need to look at, um, and so the regional flexibility needed to so there might be different approaches in the northeast, might be different approaches in London. As we'll see in the interwar years, many of the appeals that, for example, like the Big Four, like if we take the LNER, their advertising in the northeast of England is very different from what it is in London. They're advertising in the high-end magazines in London, the Sphere, the Illustrated London News, and they're doing some really interesting but different work to what they're doing in the northeast. And I want to look a bit more at that at some point. How much? So we've got Chris has asked how much flexibility did rail companies have fares? Weren't they obliged to charge a fixed cost per mile on every train? Were cheap tickets limited to special trains? Well, the workmen's fares were mandated, and the Cheap Trains Act, but if they were under no sort of legislation on actual pricing, apart from on those services, on the workmen's trains and cheap trains and all those. So they weren't obliged to. They had to put on a cheap train on each route from the 1840s, and this changed in the 1880s, 1890s. Memory doesn't quite serve me well, but for example, your first class passenger, your second class passenger, the railway could effectively charge what they wanted, especially third class, and third class. But third class passengers are in the dominant category by the 1890s. So 95% of all passengers by the turn of the century are third class. But in a lot of those cases, the pricing wasn't fixed by legislation, only on those on certain categories of ticket. But so I'm going to move on here now. So we've got that. So I got asked a question actually by one of my students about in the Railway magazine and the Railway, Railway and Travel Monthly. There are these very gushing stories about railway activities and in terms of advertising, in terms of resorts, in terms of all these things. And I was asked, was this supply copy? Well, I think it was. I think a lot of this goes on. So what you've got up on the screen is two pieces of advertising from the Illustrated London News of 1909. These I've cut them up to fit them on the screen, but the top is actually is actually in this above it, the advert. So you get the LNWR advert below, and then you get this nice piece of descriptive text above. And I think that the railways. I didn't think it finished the link there. It's the British Newspaper Archive, if anyone's interested. But they are basically combined. They're sent in together. You also get this time the emergence of early PR. Now, there is an academic called Mike Heller who I'd recommend, and we'll talk a bit more about Mike's work a bit later. He says that PR actually comes out of the First World War propaganda. I actually think that the seeds are being sown before the First World War, and one of the reasons I think this is that the London North Western Railway were actually in collaboration with resorts in North Wales, giving people tours round North Wales, sort of organised tours where they would go and show off different resorts, and they would, oh, come and look at this one, Llandudno, and they were doing that, and the Great Northern do that as well. Well, the East Coast mainline companies. So I think there's very much this sense across the corporate spectrum that with the development of the press, and of course the press develops in the, from the mid-century, becomes a mass media, you get the emergence of mass press organizations, or sort of the popular press, so the Daily Mirror, Daily Mail, that actually managing the press is a useful way to craft a public image to sell services. The railways, I don't think, are just. I can't believe that the railways are the only ones who are doing this. I can't believe they're the only ones who's trying to sell that message, take that approach. I think it must have been going on elsewhere. So, and actually, I found Whitbread, the brewer, inviting people into the brewery in the 1870s to look how sterile and clean our brewery is. So, I think that sort of idea is perhaps ingrained by this First World War. We need to take a look at that. The other thing I want to sort of point out here is the imagery. It's very, so if you look on the right, it's very sort of traditional, it's idyllic views, it's picturesque. And the picturesque is a big idea in this period. And again, I'm going to foreground the work of Alex Medcalf here, who's done a lot of work on how the railways used a manipulative photography and we'll get to a bit more of what he says a bit later, but how they used a manipulated photography to sell a certain image and a certain perception of the places they're trying to sell. But it's very, shall we say, come to this place, come to this picturesque, idyllic environment that will take you away from all the stresses and strains of the city. It's not, and of course the same with the beach. It's kind of non-threatening. So the resorts in this period were, you get a sense, and you get this back into the 1850s, 40s, and Susan Major has talked about this in her work on excursion trains. Actually, you get a sense of, well, we're going to bring in people from a long way away, and it's going to be an invasion. It's going to be a source of tension and conflict. And that says a lot about sort of how people perceive the world and how they think about it. But you got the resort on the left, and actually it's quite non-threatening. Everybody's mixing. It's a nice place. There are some horses. It's quite beautiful. It's not really, shall we say, lifestyle marketing communications. The other thing I would point out here is you get market segmentation again. So the LNW is here talking about, look, you've got many amusements, golf. So if you're a golfer, it's for you. And actually, the LNW owned a golf course in North Wales, in Anglesey. Although I don't know whether I should call Anglesey North Wales. I'm not entirely sure. Does it think of itself as part of North Wales? Not sure. But it is in North Wales, but you know what I mean. So, but also on the left, you've got moors, waterfalls, streams, and castles. And you've got this great phrase, 9 Southerners out of 10 do not know North Wales. So they're trying to sort of, and then on the right, actually 10 people out of each 10 should know. And the LNWR was actually praised by the North Wales tourist authorities for boosting their trade and getting North Wales out there to people. And I would argue that it's not the resorts who had limited income to spend on advertising It's not the resorts that actually boost North Wales as a holiday resort. It is actually the London North Western and latterly the LMS. So let's have a look. Also, we're going to talk a bit about posters, and I am a critic of the poster. I had a friend say to me, Tim, he said to me, posters are a bit of a blunt tool, and they are. I think I agree with Tim there. I do. Because, they're about brand building, they're about identity of the company, they're about all these things. And we got two very interesting posters. Posters were not the main form of advertising. They're the main form of advertising I think we remember. I think posters are really interesting and fascinating. And these two tell us something about the messages the Midland and London South Western Railway were trying to project. A predominantly, should we say, upper middle class and upper class market looking for comfortable travel will look at these images and can say, I see myself here. I personally think both these ones are a bit ugly. Don't know. Who else thinks they're ugly? But they sell a message, they sell an idyllic view. Again, it's not very much it's not stylized in the way that later output would be. It's selling an idyllic view, an aspirational view, and I think that of course, the one on the right is Windsor. It's at Windsor, and it's trying to sell an idea about the company, the sort of places it serves, and the resorts the routes it goes through. To what extent did your view did the railways invent the seaside resort? Railways very rarely actually created resorts. A lot of the resort development is a byproduct of the railway's arrival. It opens up, it facilitates transport, but like if you take somewhere like Blackpool, it was already had people travelling to Blackpool before. Uh, Brighton changes with the arrival of the railway. Um, the Brighton changes actually when the wealthy people who occupied Brighton as a holiday resort get an influx of should we say, Londoners. They jump ship. They go to the spa towns. They go to south of France. So that changes. So I think railways didn't create resorts, but they did facilitate travel to them. But some resorts, of course, didn't really change with a railway connection. I think it's Scarborough, but might need to be corrected, that remained with a railway connection. Um, Remained with a railway connection, but not a developed resort until later on. I do think that later on, railways start to manipulate which resorts they focus on. The LNER, the London North Eastern, as I'm going to talk about a bit later, definitely tried to focus on certain resorts that it had more resorts than the pre-grouping companies that it absorbed. So it did try and focus on particular resorts to the detriment of others. But anyway, another thing to point out here is that actually it's very much a period where people start going abroad for travel purposes. Um, Did the Big Four or the other major constituents have a variation of Metroland? No, not sort of. Metroland, the Metropolitan Railway had a very much well, they had a unique situation. Most railway companies had to sell off their land when it was done, when they didn't need it. Metropolitan Railway set up state companies so they could create Metroland. But, and the caveat to that, is that a lot of railway companies cooperated with developers, especially into war years, when you get the rise of the estate, a sort of middle class out of movement, especially around London, and you get them cooperating with developers and local authorities to do the things that the Metroland were doing internally. Um, the Great Eastern, sort of, if we think about Ilford, they cooperate with, well, there was a developer who cooperated with the railway, who cooperated with builders, and the local government. So, and the railways promoted these places as through publications similar to the Metropolitan Railway. So the answer is sort of yes and no. And maybe that's for another time. That's another discussion. So there's just some more posters. They're a bit messy. They're a bit all over the place by later standards. And I'm going to move on because we need to move on quickly. But yes, the interesting extension to the GWR services by Motor Coach. I think these two are in the National Railway Museum's collection, so I should have put a copyright thing, but they're all right. But yes. Anyway, so we move on to the interwar years, and the interwar years, you get a development of that sense of looking out for what passengers want, trying to think more about passengers' needs. And this is a period where other companies, I think there is a misconception that much of modern marketing came from a post World War II era. But actually, as I think I've demonstrated, you can trace it back to before the First World War. But it's really the interwar years where these sort of ideas about marketing in its broadest sense start to come to the fore nationally with a rise of consumer culture. So, for example, a company like Roundtree, Robert Fitzgerald's work on Roundtree has showed that it was doing market research. It was feeding that into product development, and it was thinking about a whole process, perhaps in a much more rudimentary way than we recognise. But it's the emergence of modern marketing, and scholars have recently dispelled two ideas principle. One is the post World War II one that I've discussed, but also the idea that Britain's marketing strategies were behind the United States. And I think there's a lot more research to be done. People like Peter Scott have talked about it in terms of house building, and there's a whole gamut of things we can talk about. I think railways are one of the, should we say, leading areas where marketing comes to the fore. So firstly, they start thinking more clearly about their passengers and who are they and what they're thinking about and how they're getting information, trying to craft products better to them. I'm not saying they're perfect. I'm not saying they're the best in the around. They make horrendous mistakes, and I think there's institutional drift. But they do start thinking about it. So Alex Medcalf has talked about the GWR conveyed to its readers a column in its staff magazine about people we've pleased and people we've not pleased. I've found evidence of the LNER actually thinking about, well, we've got this campaign coming up. Let's go and talk to middle class people in this region. So I think there is a real sense that they're starting to think about the customer base. I don't think they get it right. I don't think they have perhaps the resources. This needs a bit more work. Maybe they don't have the resources to do it on the scale. Also, railway marketing is harder, I would argue, than marketing, say, a chocolate bar. And what I mean by that, let me just Hansback and Hobday branded glass as well. What I mean by that is, if you're selling a chocolate bar, you need to investigate who might like that chocolate bar. Do people like that chocolate bar? How can we sell that? How can we think about product development? And how many different railway journeys were there in the 19th and early 20th century? How many destinations? How many routes? How many journeys do people go on? They go on hundreds, thousands, millions of different routes. Even if you're thinking about, say, the LNER's elite services, the real elite, the top, how many of the people going from point A to point B on the same journey? They're not really. They're not. they might be going to different places and might be going to different resorts. So there's an interesting thing there about they're selling a much more complex range of services with users who have a much more complex needs. So they need to perhaps group much more carefully. Um, they need to start thinking about sort of broader factors and broader things. So I think what I wanted to actually, why I put these two on the screen is you've got two very different products here. On the left, you've got a specific product. And so this was great. The LNER actually would, if an FA Cup match went to a draw and there was a replay arranged, they could do the turnaround on the newspaper advertising within a day. So the newspaper notice would be in the press for the day, in the day. So you've got an excursion or a short trip there, a service, and that would be in the newspaper. There might be handbills given out, so not sophisticated. On the right, you've got the Southern Electric, new link with the Conqueror's Coast, now running frequency, comfort, cheap fares. That's a general advert. Now, it is appealing to a range of people on a different range of services, but it is a general advert that was in a magazine called, I think it was in the Sphere. And what that's doing, that's trying to sell an idea about speed, about opportunity, frequent comfort, cheap fares daily. So those are two very different types of offering. This isn't like a dairy nut milk bar or or a milk. It's so long since I've had chocolate. Sorry, but they're very different offerings there. So they need to sell them in very different ways. Now, I'm going to take you back to the strategy here because actually they're doing something different, similar. A Halo model. We have to look that one up. Don't know what that means. But they're doing something very different. They are trying to sell a service, different types of services. Simon, what's a Halo model? I haven't heard that term used before. Forgive me. But they are selling very different services. One of the things I will say is that they are very much, the strategies might be similar. The underpinning idea is that you craft a consistent message across all outputs. And I'm going to mention Mike Heller again. He said that the GPO were doing this. They were the General Post Office. They as in a very expensive thing, you advertise that encourage people to buy the cheaper thing. Thanks, John. I'll get to that in a second. So what happens is they have a philosophy that you can identify in the Edwardian period, and we would now call it, or it's been labelled since the 1990s, integrated marketing communications. That idea that the message in all the different outlets is the same. So the newspaper advert, the handbill, and the other forms of advertising bill will all say the same things. That's fine. But actually, if we think about something like the South Coast, all the publications, I think in all the publications, they would have had the same message. They would be selling the same idea, and you integrate it so that people move along a chain. So, for example, what you've got on here, you've got Ask at SR Stations for a special pamphlet. So what you're doing there, you're taking the user on a journey. You're taking them from here's an advert telling you what's going on, here's a pamphlet. So you're taking them through a journey. They might read the pamphlet, and then another advert might reinforce it. So I think you go through a different you go through a process, and a lot of campaigns in this period really were thought about in this strategic term. How can we get people to not just encounter the message, but absorb the message and take it home with them, and take it home and imbue it and act on it. So it's a more strategic way of thought rather than a lot of adverts in the 19th century was bang, here's your single advert. So they start doing that. So a halo model, very expensive thing. I think there is a part of that. I think public image is a very big thing, and the railways tend to like we are subject to it. We are still um, imbued with a sense of that idea because when people look at the Interwar Railways, they think it's Flying Scotsman, they think it's Mallard, they think it's Royal Scot, Cheltenham Flyer, and all these grand things. People think of the posters, and this is slightly my objection to focusing on the posters, because that's an image created through corporate PR. People were rather not happy. That's not a good image. They weren't overly impressed with railway services. I think I think that the railways did try and project their elite services, and they did try and project them for, you know, we are a company that actually will sell you wondrous things. But when you get complaints about people going to say Scarborough, and they're really, really, really annoyed about how bad the service is in 1939, they probably actually creates a sharp tension between what they see and what they actually are receiving. And people were not happy with the railways at the end of the 1930s. There's a great mass observation report, and I've got a video on it from 1939 that actually just surveyed 6,500 passengers and said they weren't happy with railway services, basically universally. People liked the railways, but they weren't overly happy about them. So, how did people have time to travel? Well, actually, you get statutory leave comes in this period. People's real incomes are growing up, so upper middle class, particularly, people are owning motor cars in this period, and actually the Southern Railway advert very much is a nod to modernity, which the motor car represented. There's a huge second-hand car market in this period. Very church on Sunday. Not many people went to church on Sunday, not in the proportions that I think people think. I'm no expert on it, but I think church surveys maybe put them, not as many people went as we possibly think. And although saying that, I found that NNER in 1932 were thinking about a general campaign for Sunday services, Sunday excursions, and actually they stopped a general idea because they didn't want to annoy people who might go to church. So there is a bit of that. And by 1937-38, actually, there's a bit of recovery. So there is a market there for people who go on holiday. They can go on, they can go on excursions. So, and there's more discretionary spending. So, like, this is a period where consumer durables start actually being bought in greater numbers. So, and people are buying homes. Middle class people are able to afford homes. In fact, many, working people, Peter Scott has talked about this, can afford homes. So this is the right period of much more consumption going on. Let's move on. Of course, we got these great posters. The Railways Commission, of course, great notable artists, Royal Academicians to do it. And I think this actually is, we talked about the rise of PR, but I think actually the PR mechanism gets going, working. So make lovely posters. Royal Academicians, great. But this is about being a patron of the arts. In fact, in some sense, it's not actually about necessarily selling a service. It's about showing people a good corporate image. We are a patron of the arts. We invest in arts. So I think actually there's a message there they're trying to sell. They're trying to create a positive image about themselves. And other companies do the same. I think it's BP do the same. Try and, commission artists to sell particular services. Oh, sorry, sell the company as a sort of moral or a responsible company. Other companies do that too, and the railways do it in terms of trying to show themselves as these moral and responsible companies. We talked earlier about we talked earlier about press, sort of the idea about photography being manipulated to to sell a lifestyle. Very much in the Edwardian period, and again, I'm going to foreground Alex Medcalf's work on this. He's done some fantastic work on photographic advertising. These are from one of the London North Eastern Railways guys. He focused very much on the Great Western Railway um, guides, because there is a huge library at the National Rail Museum of photographs. And actually, one of the great things that he reveals is that the Great Western Railway used to scratch out telegraph masts to present an idyllic view of the West Country and parts of Wales. But one of the things you get that shift from, I was talking about the photographs that sell you an idea of getting away from London, getting away from the hustle and bustle. What we see in the 1930s is a growth, as I said, about sort of consumer spending, there's actually more liberation. This is where you get the bathing belt, you get much more freedoms, greater freedoms, in terms of sort of bathing wear and stuff. And I haven't put them up there, but the guides do have bathing bells in them throughout. And actually, people got more money and can spend. And there's sort of an aspirational element to this, but as you can see, it's much more about relaxed sociability. It's not so much the focus has moved away from the sort of historic and the traditional views. It's moved towards a sort of very sociable one. There's pictures on the beach of families together. So it's sort of, you can take your family. It's not that sort of far away picture of the seaside. So they really manipulate photographic imagery to present an idealized version of the environments they're trying to sell. Aspiration is a big part of that, especially, should we say, middle class audience. Also, there's a sort of sense about the competing against motor cars. So 2 million cars are on the road by 1939. And actually, people, they try and sell a safe and welcoming environment in the carriage. So you get staged shots, you get model actresses. The Great Western Railway, in Alex's work, he reports that the Great Western Railway would hire actresses and actors to actually pose shots to show a relaxed, comfort environment. You don't need to worry about a motor car. You don't need about the hassle. There's also sort of, with regard to, say, walking, and they changed walking. It was originally, I think I might got this right way around, but they turn it into rambling, which is a less, shall we say, much more relaxed sort of way of life. It's much more sort of friendly. It's not walking, which is quite go forward, and they actually changed the terminology to make it less intense, less stressful, shall we say. So they changed, and they very much are feeding off the feelings in the world about a sort of more relaxed world, a more affluent people with more money. The other thing I want to talk about a little bit is stations. So this is one of my favourite stations near where my parents live, Surbiton Station. We get the emergence of revised station design. Of course, marketing isn't just about the advertising. It's about selling the package of services and selling like the destination along with the experience. The railways have a bad reputation. Their stations have a bad reputation in the 1920s and 30s for being grimy, dingy. Liverpool Street has a particularly bad reputation. And they start rethinking station design, and they start reorientating it towards the idea that actually Network Rail have started to come through with, of turning stations into destination stations. There's a report in 1944 that drew on a lot of pre-war thinking by the Railway Companies Association, talking about, we need to make them into destinations themselves. The people would go to the station to do more than just get on a train. And as you can see from Surbiton, Surbiton has this area on the right, which I think was one of the waiting rooms, but it had shops and it had some, things to go. Simon, you live 3 stops down the line. Yes, my parents live probably 3 stops the other way at Hampton Court. 2 stops the other way at Hampton Court. but they tried reshaping the station space. The LNER actually, other companies did it too, but the LNER's Brighter Station scheme uh, that was designed to perk up the station environment with experimenting with different paint schemes. And to give you an idea of actually just how thinking about the consumer they were, how focused they were, they actually did tests on consumer interest in the different coloured paint schemes and whether they liked them. And then, of course, alongside through some more practical tests to do with, well, this one gets dirty, that one doesn't get dirty, but they're thinking about the station space. The other thing is, I think that they very much sort of push the best kept stations competitions, especially on rural branches. But unfortunately, bus services were cutting so hard into rural services that it did very little to actually these competitions that improve the station environment. And I think the passengers or the residents were very proud when their local station won a best kept stations competition. But actually, that didn't increase patronage. So the station almost moves conceptually out of the domain of being a point of departure and arrival, conceptually to being a part of the community that won a prize. So, Owen, hello, Owen. Was there a lot of joint marketing between railway and resorts? Think, think Instant Skegness is so bracing. Did Skeggy have any skin in the game, or was it purely an ER-inspired campaign? Yes. The railway. So the first major instance, there was tension between resorts and the railway companies. So the London North Western Railway was quite a pioneer in this. It set up so Blackpool is unique in the period before the First World War in that it can use taxes, local taxes, to raise the rates. Sorry, it can use rates to raise money for advertising. It's a quirk of law that they're not really sure why it came about, but other resorts could not use money in that way. So what the London North Western Railway does is it creates these collective organisations. So the North Wales Advertising Board is what it sets up, and it's a contributor. Or it's not initially, but it sets it up, and all the different local resorts pay into it, and they advertise as a group. Come to North Wales. It's hugely successful. The London North Western Railway gets involved, but the railways and the resorts cannot make agreements until after legislation early in the interwar years. They can't make agreements for joint advertising. But what we do see is collaboration. And before the First World War, although the Great Eastern Railway's advertising manager said at one point, a resort can undo much good work by inflicting a horrendous poster on the general public. After the Second World War, the railways stopped forming agreements with the change of law. Many of the advertising campaigns were half and half. Were half and half invested by the railway companies. I think the LMS had 300 such agreements. Maybe I might have overstated that, but they had a lot of agreements between different locations and themselves. But there's a lot of tension, and I think this again is something we need to look into more. I have a student who's doing a dissertation on this, and hopefully they will reveal a bit more. And they will reveal a bit more, and we will find out more. But I think there's a lot of tension because who's going to pay for this? Who's going to pay for that? So there's always a bit of a negotiation goes on, and sometimes it's better than the others. Gareth asks a question. Were Best Kept Station Awards part of a wider British nostalgism that we see that was indeed a feature of the 1950s and before? Well, I think it's part of the, should we say, construction of British conceptions about perceptions about the railways. Country stations are all beautiful. Well, a couple of caveats on that. Firstly, not every station entered. Only about a third of stations on the LNER were entering towards the end of the period, 1939. Sorry. And I think also there is a sense that these stations were not well used. One of the reasons your local station won a competition is because the staff had not much to do. And I think what this does is because it's reported in glowing terms, because it feeds through into ideas that we have in Britain about sort of or particularly England, about the nature of the English countryside, that it gets lodged as a sort of facet of the railway environment. But actually, in practical terms, I don't think it did much for the railways for gaining traffic. So yeah, I think it is part of that element, that sort of nostalgia for a British Railways that perhaps actually never existed. But that's for another time. So I'm going to finish my slides on this one. Meet the Sun on the East Coast. Meet the Sun on the East Coast is a fascinating campaign that I have done some work on, and this is one of the most advanced campaigns that I think the railways ever ran in up to the interwar period. So the LNER was nearly bankrupt in 1938. So what they decided to do was because there was a bit of a downturn. The Surbiton picture was taken in 1938 or 9, Simon. So the Meet the Sun campaign was one of the most advanced campaigns. The LNER was nearly bankrupt. There was an economic slump in 38. And the chairman stands up and says, we need, we can't go on like this. And there's a whole other story to unpack about the legislation the railways are working under. But what Cecil Dandridge, the mastermind of the LNER's advertising campaign, do is they have this general campaign called Meet the Sun on the East Coast. He takes money from other campaigns to be able to, flesh it out. It combines every form of advertising, and even ones that are not Meet the Sun have stickers applied to them. There are banners at stations. The resorts that are served by the LNR also get small motifs Meet the Sun. They're already engaged with it, and the messaging is consistent, clear. Meet the Sun on the East Coast, and this is really interesting because this is a theme the LNER has been developing throughout its advertising. Excuse me. It's been developing this theme throughout its advertising. It started off in the early 1920s with a campaign called On the Drier Side, because the east coast of Britain had less rain than the west coast. So that sort of idea that on the east coast there's sunny holidays available. And so the campaign is across all things. You wouldn't have, if you were living in Britain at this time, you would not have got away from it. The unfortunate thing is, firstly, it rains horrendously in July 1939. And one newspaper said it would have been all right if Old Sun had kept up its side of the bargain. The other thing is there's a huge PR campaign to bolster it. So they take journalists around some of the areas to some of the resorts. On top of that, there's an insurance company that insured against rain-soaked holidays, so they get them on board as well during the course of their campaign. So you get that sort of stakeholder management. So what the case is, this is a very advanced, very sophisticated across all different mediums campaign. We don't know how well it did. And the reason we don't know how well it did is because of the war, because it was never brought to its full potential. So I think there is a developmental process you get there from what we saw at the start right through to 1939, which is an increasing sophistication, an increasing manipulation of consumer desire, and increasingly thinking about how to sell services and how to grow the market against what by the 1930s was very penetrating competition into the railway's margins, to the point where the LNER was suffering. I mean, that was freight. They were doing badly on freight because they served a lot of served a lot of heavy industry, which have been really hard hit by the Depression. But in terms of passenger services, they did well, I think, on this one. So I think that's the last one. So it is. So thank you very much, everybody, for tuning in. I'll go back before I do my roundup. I hope you've enjoyed it. It's a bit of a whistle stop tour, and I'm doing things from memory a bit, but I hope you've enjoyed it. And next time we've got my good friend Kevin Tennant, who's coming along. So Kevin and I have been we published a paper on trams. Kevin also has published on the York Corporation tramways. We'll also be talking about pacers, and Kevin and I have been digging around in the National Archives looking at pacers, and I think Kevin and I are thinking about sort of project management of the PACE project, and that question: did it save rural railways? We're sceptical about that one. Next time. So if you like the show, I do have a coffee. All the coffees are gratefully received. And finally, I want to give a shout out to my MA. We are now recruiting for the MA in Railway Studies through the University of York. It's completely online, 3 years part-time, and we look at lots of issues like this and all things under the sun. British railway history from 1825 to 2010, but we look at things like modal shift, we look at competition, we look at mobility flows, we look at everything. So we're now recruiting for that if you're interested. So that is really it. And I hope you've enjoyed this first one. Please do come back for next one, the next one with Kevin. We'll have more guests, and if any of my academic friends are out there and other people would like to say something, please ask questions away in this, and I am happy to have shown you everything I've shown you today. So I will see you soon, and cheers.